Hello, my name is John Solomon. I'm with the Good Faith Cybersecurity Researchers Coalition, an initiative of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network. We're a not-for-profit activity that serves to advance the objectives and recommendations of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, on legal protections for responsible cybersecurity researchers. This is quite a mouthful, but essentially what we advocate with industry, with academia, and non-governmental organizations is ways to support the development and adoption of legislative, judicial, and other measures that protect the ability of cybersecurity vulnerability researchers to do their research, to find new vulnerabilities in software, and to publish these in a responsible, consistent format. We're not a part of the OECD. We are friends with them, but we talk to non-government entities while the OECD speaks to government. This is the latest in a series of video interviews, and also for our listeners joining us on our podcast-only audio series with stakeholders from various organizations to discuss their views of the challenges currently facing cybersecurity researchers, as well as what the role is of legislative action, judicial action in helping to protect these. As hopefully is clear from our own mission statement, we believe that the open and ready and timely access to new cybersecurity vulnerabilities is critical for not only the ability for organizations to defend themselves, but also societal stability and the safety of individuals working in an increasingly digitized economy. Today, I'm here with Dr. Mischa Hansel. He is, and I'm going to hopefully I'm going to get this right. We talked about this being also quite a mouthful before. The head of the research focus on international cybersecurity at the IFSH. I'm not going to give you the German name, but essentially the Institute for Peace Research and Security at the University of Hamburg. You can visit them at their website at ifsh.de. That is India Foxtrot Sierra Hotel.de. As always, I'm going to put a link to them and to Mischa's profile in the video description and the audio descriptions as well. So Mischa, thanks very much for taking the time today. If you'd like to give a quick introduction and overview of who you are and what your organization does.
Yes, thanks, John, and thanks for having me. We are a Peace Research Institute in Germany that has been around for a long time. So since the 1970s, focusing very much on conventional arms control, nuclear arms control, and now also on cybersecurity. So our research focus is funded by the German Foreign Office. It was established 2 years ago, and we look at cybersecurity problems and solutions from an international angle, from international perspective. We are peace researchers, but we have different backgrounds. So I'm a political scientist by training, but my colleagues, for example, are also computer scientists. And other colleagues come from other disciplines. So it's both people from the social science, but also from the natural sciences. And because we face sort of wicked problems where you really have to use different bodies of knowledge and combine them to really understand what is going on. So we focus on cybersecurity challenges, as for example, state actors and their relationship to cybercrime, but also, for example, stockpiling of vulnerabilities by state actors, different legal regimes when it comes to the protection or rather non-protection of security researchers in many cases, and what can be done particularly by cyber diplomacy to tackle these issues.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I'm going to jump right in, and I think let's pick up on the topic of state actors. Now, the elephant in the room right now is, you can probably tell where my political sympathies lie here. Is Russia. But, in the past, we've also seen Chinese actors, as even the early APTs engaging mainly in espionage, North Korean actors engaging mainly in fraud and sabotage, Iranian actors, let's be honest, also American and other Western actors, Israeli, etc., weaponizing cyber attacks and vulnerabilities against various targets. Now, without going into who the quote unquote good guys or bad guys are, this is, I think we're seeing a growing understanding in, let's say, not only public sector circles, national cybersecurity centers, even military, and national CSIRTs, but also various public-private areas such as ISACs and collective defense initiatives. That this is a serious issue, all the way from basic fraud campaigns of state-tolerated actors, all the way up to, for example, what we've seen with the Russian Internet Research Agency. Can you talk a little bit more about the current trajectory of this kind of weaponized cybersecurity state actor activity, and how the growth in use of critical vulnerability affects societies around the world?
Yeah, sure. I mean, of course, it's a big question, so I won't be able to cover all of this. At least not in a single answer. And of course, there's many things that I just don't know and cannot really do research about, because there are data availability issues of all kinds. But your description, yeah, I would basically agree, of course. So the stakes are getting higher. We all know about these attacks also against critical infrastructures. The way we depend on these systems and the way we are vulnerable, or that vulnerabilities that are exploited can hurt us, this is growing as well. So I think, on the positive side, there's also more awareness of the benefits that we gain from this large community of security researchers, and this is a good thing. But on the other hand, there's also developments like, I would describe this as a nationalization of cybersecurity research, for example, by China. So when you look at recent legislation that came out from China, or even before, some years before, China prevented basically Chinese security researchers from participating in hacking competitions. And then there's new regulation that seem to require security researchers to report to the state authorities within 48 hours. So basically reporting 0 days way before they can be patched by vendors. And also China very explicitly defined vulnerabilities as a national asset. So you have these kind of nationalization tendencies that sort of undermine what the kind of transnational cyber research community that we have. And I think both developments run in parallel. So there's growing awareness. There are policymakers that now think about how to better protect security researchers, how to improve the collaboration between the public and private actors. But there's also states, and China is of course not the only one, trying to exploit these vulnerabilities and to get more control also of private actors that are knowledgeable about vulnerabilities.
I apologize for the breadth of the question. I like to lead off with broad ones to give my interview partners a chance to kind of unfold some of their expertise in an open field. It's a really good observation about the increasing exertion of control over vulnerability research and reporting. And I want to counter that by referring to a phenomenon that we've seen increasingly over, let's say, the past 15 to 20 years, and that is private actors developing and selling vulnerabilities and malicious software. NSO Group, Pegasus, Kingfisher. German has a wonderful word for some of these, the Bundestrojaner, in English, the federal Trojan. And what we see in Western, quote unquote, Western liberal democracies is that there is frequently a tendency by law enforcement to try and justify use of these, through public safety and infiltration of criminal gangs, terrorist gangs, etc. But how do you see the evolution of, let's say, for example, commercial actors who are developing covertly and selling these kinds of weaponized vulnerabilities to governments, whether, again, quote unquote, good guys or bad guys?
That's a very good question. well, I think it's one thing. One thing is what we can observe, if we can observe all this cybersecurity ecology, so to speak. And the other thing is, what are the reasons for whatever we observe? So I mean, I think it's fair to say that up until now, this whole market is still very much unregulated. But then the question is it unregulated because there are actors that, so far at least, wanted it to be pretty much unregulated, or is it because they were unable to do so? So now, I mean, what we now see with the US, for example, saying that, well, if you want to sell products to the US government, you can no longer export, or you can no longer sell to certain authoritarian countries, and you cannot sell to actors that then basically spy on US citizens, is a sort of new regulatory effort to increase control over this market. And I think others will follow suit. They will also come up with a new regulation, and then we have to see if these tighter regulations will really have an impact on the ground. And to me, this is an open question. So it's so we see more regulation, we see more efforts to control these actors. Also, a lot of these efforts and regulations are not compatible with each other. So there's a sort of fragmentation on the regulatory level. But the question then is, does it really affect those who discover, report, or also sell vulnerabilities on the ground? Does it really have an impact on the market itself? I think this is still an open question.
And this is a really interesting point, actually, that I hadn't previously considered, the idea of regulation of through export controls of vulnerabilities and exploitation software. Because as we all know, governments have let's say a mixed record with regulation, including through export controls of cybersecurity software, all the way down to algorithms. I mean, those of you who are old like me, you may remember the RSA and 5 lines of Perl stickers that had this label is classified as a munition by the US government warning on them, that were sold as a joke. And now if we see this move towards not controlling the export of well, they still do, of protective technologies, but of exploitative technologies as munitions, and I don't know if even, arms control regimes like I believe it's called ITAR, get involved in this. Do you think that without talking about the exploitation software, the malware, the spy, and the spyware, that, and I mean, this is a leading question. I know the answer to this, but do you think that there is a benefit to particularly liberal societies, liberal democratic free market societies, from a more consistent availability and timely availability of the kinds of vulnerabilities that, whether authoritarian governments or any governments or these kinds of vendors, would normally sell covertly? And how would that impact? How does the lack of availability of these kinds of vulnerabilities to, for example, industry and governments, affect their ability to defend themselves?
I'm sorry, I have to ask you, can you rephrase the question? I'm still trying to understand it.
It's a long question here. I postulate that the availability of vulnerabilities in a responsible but publicly available eventually format is good for the economies and societies of liberal democratic countries. Can you talk a little bit more about the way in which making such vulnerabilities publicly available, and how you make them publicly available, can affect that security of our societies and economies overall? When industry and society, governments, etc., have a consistent and dependable access to new vulnerabilities as they come out, rather than finding out about them from some malicious state actor, for example.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I feel in an ideal world, there would be coordinated vulnerability disclosure all over the place, and we would have harmonized standards. and they would be implemented both by private actors but also by state actors. So we would also have vulnerability equities processes like emulated by other state actors. I mean, now this is just a couple of states who started to use and to develop and use these processes, and there are still many issues, lack of transparency, lack of accountability, and all that. So there's a lot to improve, but at least some states have defined certain principles and certain processes, and these are used and can be criticized. I think yes, of course. I mean, stockpiling vulnerabilities always comes with the risk that someone else can exploit the very same vulnerability and can do a lot of harm. So this is a very risky decision that should only be made if at all, under special circumstances, and there should be also some sort, at least of public oversight, or at least parliamentary oversight. I mean, we have similar issues like with the intelligence services. I'm not sure if I would frame this as of course it's a benefit. I would say it would even be a benefit to non-democratic societies, at least to not to the state actors, of course, but to the people living in non-democratic societies, because making public in a responsible way vulnerabilities is actually a global public good. So everybody is benefiting from this. It's like if somebody is able to lock a door that is way open, it's a benefit, of course. But the special thing about cyber is that this door is not only leading to your house; it's leading to all other houses at the same time, right? So and no one knows before who is entering what by exploiting this vulnerability, because I think it's fair to say that systems are so interconnected that it's really hard to say beforehand who is going to be affected by what vulnerability, and especially if we also include open source software and all that. So yes, I think it's a benefit to many actors, and there's only a minority of actors that benefit from withholding and stockpiling these vulnerabilities.
And I mean, the corollary to that is the ongoing discussion about building backdoors into encryption systems by law enforcement and other agencies. As you say, vulnerability that affects me will affect everybody. So that's a good point. Now in 2010 we had Stuxnet. Wasn't the first, for sure. It's not the last. 2014 the Dutch Foreign Intelligence Service they hacked a bunch of security cameras at the Russian SVR. Do you see it? Again, I keep saying liberal democracies, and it's not just affecting these countries, but I think generally in these countries we have more of an oversight culture and mechanism than in other systems. Do you see a tension between mainly intelligence, foreign intelligence, law enforcement, and militaries, between the perceived need to stockpile vulnerabilities as an offensive tool or a countermeasures tool, and this public good?
Yes, of course. I mean, I think the key is to being able to identify these trade-offs and to have a democratically legitimate process of somehow deciding on these trade-offs. So I think there are legitimate concerns and legitimate interests of security agencies to use these vulnerabilities for certain purposes, but then the question is there what is the overall impact of withholding this vulnerability? So it would be wrong, of course, for, let's say, state law enforcement agencies to decide on this alone. And this is why I think the basic idea behind this vulnerability equities process is right, to bring different actors on the table. What one should or might criticize is, however, if really all relevant stakeholders are sitting on the table. So because it's of course difficult to open these processes to civil society actors, but in theory at least, there should be some agency representing the interests of basically each and every user or society writ large in these processes. So I think we have to live with these kind of trade-offs. And yes, there's something that something with like withholding this kind of information, perhaps even any kind of information, that goes against the very principle of democratic life, so to speak, right? So there's always this kind of tension. But I would say this is nothing entirely new, right? Because we had this with intelligence services, and intelligence services are, pretty much the oldest business around, right? So
second oldest.
The second oldest, yeah, maybe the second, maybe the first, maybe the second, yes. But so there are certain practices that are hard to reconcile with democratic principles, but then also hard to completely get rid of, right? So that's why we need to have certain assurances that really each and every legitimate perspective is included in these kind of processes. Of course, other regimes like authoritarian regimes do not have to worry about this at all, because they do not accept a certain legitimate interest or autonomy of social actors at all. So they just say that, well, the governmental interests and the state interests are just basically the same. And so they and you find this also when you look at international negotiations. So the way they think about cybersecurity problems is very different. So they do not see any need to limit state control or state rights in this kind of area.
Now, if you look at the Belgian reform to cybersecurity vulnerability disclosure laws that was announced earlier this year, I believe it was in February or March. By the way, we have a parallel video with Inti de Koikeler on that. I'll link to that below. It specifies very roughly that if an affected company does not have a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program, then part of the process is that a researcher must first disclose it to the Center for Cybersecurity Belgium, the CCB. Mm. You see a possibility that, this is a critique that has frequently come up of the Belgian rule, whatever you think of it. I have no view on it. Do you think that such a requirement, for example, in Germany would be the BSI, in the Netherlands it would be the NCSC, and the US it would be CISA or a similar agency, a requirement for reporting to a national agency first before a disclosure is made, rather than, for example, specifying a 30-day, 60-day, whatever notification period, could create a motivation for a state agency to want to monopolize and thus stockpile vulnerabilities?
Yeah, that's a very crucial issue, I think. I think the very least that needs to be in place is certain limits on how the cybersecurity agency is allowed to handle this and to do something with this information. So, for example, in the German case, the BSI is not allowed to pass over this information to, for example, the military. But it took some time for the government to clarify this issue. So there was a clarification 2 years ago, and in other cases it might still be uncertain. So what the governmental agency can and can't do with this information. Of course, you could then still argue that it's impossible to monitor compliance with this from the outside, right? And I think this is especially an issue on the international level, because then other states would have to believe into compliance with these limits. Otherwise, they would think that this is just a way, as you have said, to monopolize information on vulnerabilities. So I think it's problematic, because, of course, if you say you have to report to the authorities, let's say within 2 days, like in the case of the Chinese regulation, then this is way before there can be any patches. and way before patches are going to be released. So it gives you at least maybe roughly at least 1 month to exploit this vulnerability. And this adds to the already high amount, a level of mistrust on the international level. So I see this also as an international problem. I would say that if you come up with regulation like these, you have to make sure that there are all kinds of reassurances that this is not going to be abused. The counter argument why you might need these kind of regulations could be that, well, if the government doesn't know about vulnerabilities, it may be hard to enforce certain other rules, like, for example, the certain rules that apply to the patching of vulnerabilities. But then I think you could define other procedures that would allow the government to ex post somehow, enforce rules when it comes to the patching, so they could know ex post how much time the vendor used or before it came out and released patches and all this. So I don't think it's necessary for the government to know right from the start about 0 days.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the obligation to patch. I mean, if we look at, especially European Union rules like DORA and NIS2 and their counterparts elsewhere in the world, we see, while not an explicit requirement to patch, an increased set of demands on especially critical industry and those treating critical data, linked very closely to for example personal identifying data under GDPR, to have an increased level of supply chain security. So I find the idea very interesting that there could be maybe a conflict between a critical vulnerability, a new Log4 shell, whatever has been found or exploited, and, well, you must now within a certain time period patch this vulnerability, but maybe the vulnerability isn't even published yet. Now, you mentioned oversight before. I think this is a key concept. The ideal is, I don't know, an enlightened cooperation in a trust body, confidential, between public, private actors, nonprofits, industry, academia, etc. In reality, too many cooks spoil the pot, and there is a danger that this could be stifled by debate and inaction, which would go against the need to be able to inform and react when a critical new vulnerability comes out. Is this something that we can resolve while maintaining oversight and transparency?
Yeah, difficult question. Yeah, sure. I mean, ideally, if there's some independent body, it should still be a rather simple procedure, because otherwise you would overburden the whole issue. I think it can be done. I mean, I think maybe this is a more general point. I think that we often talk about governments as being part of the problem, and I think that's true, of course. But they could also be part of the solution. But then government is not government. So a government, we often talk about governments as unitary actors. But I think there are all kinds of ways to have a division of labor, so to speak, between different governmental agencies, and you can give assurances that certain information is not passed from one governmental entity to the other. And this also applies to other areas, right? So if some governmental entity gets hold of, let's say, medical records, it cannot, not the whole government can use this kind of data. So I think this is something that can be solved. We just need the right kinds of procedures. So I think it should be wrong to treat government as sort of a black box and to think that everything is connected, so to speak, within this black box. So the question would be, if you talk about an independent body, does it mean an independent governmental body or a true intermediary that is neither private nor public, but sort of a third party? But even if we talk of third party, I don't think that this would complicate the whole process so much that it would not work anymore. I mean, certs in a way already work as sort of intermediary in many cases, right? Or at least as a sort of default position when it comes to disclosing vulnerabilities.
And that's a good point about the non-monolithic nature of government. I mean, we just recently had yesterday there was a pretty significant revelation from the U.S. the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court that the FBI misused surveillance powers. I believe the quote from the article about it was only like 280,000 times against various protesters. So I think, even if you have, I believe, for example, in the case of the European Union, that there is good intent to protect citizens, and in most governments' cases, but there's always a potential, I think, that, whether a part of the government will exert goodwill or bad faith in terms of treating and maybe even abusing these vulnerabilities, it's not always going to be a monolithic construct.
Yeah, so sort of checks and balances, but in this case, not only between like the parliament and the executive, but rather between different governmental agencies with different portfolios or missions, right?
Now, one of your points that you've brought up a couple of times now has been international coordination. I think this is a big issue, and why the OECD recommendations are such a powerful tool to at least the G20 governments. Do you see progress being made in this regard, that more countries are talking to each other about a coordinated treatment of vulnerabilities and protection of researchers? Or is this something that is still stagnant and has a long way to go in terms of similar policy approaches?
Yeah, I think it is still a long way to go. So I don't see very substantial progress right now. I think we will need a lot more negotiation and talking between like-minded actors. I mean, beyond like-minded actors becomes even more difficult. So for example, when you look at the United Nations, so at a truly multilateral level, then of course you have the UN cyber norms since 2015. You have one norm focusing on responsible disclosure that at least requires states to support these kind of activities, but then the norm is so vague, and so you could basically say that almost everything sort of complies with this norm. So it's I don't say that it's irrelevant because it's a starting point, but there you see that international agreement in this area is very much limited. But then even between, for example, NATO countries, there's a lot that has to be improved. I mean, you already mentioned the different regulations and different levels of protection for security researchers. So there's a lot of variation. Of course, this is in a sense, it's very odd because we talk about global interactions and global problems. So, I mean, in most cases, it's not like somebody is like sitting in Germany and disclosing vulnerabilities to a German entity only, and it doesn't affect anybody else in other countries. So it's truly a global issue. So I think this kind of fragmentation needs at least to be reduced. But there are also other issues, like you also mentioned export control, right? So, and what we now see is that, just to give you an example, like bug bounty platforms kicking out, like, for example, researchers from Russia or other countries, and because of the sanctions. So, and I do not say that sanctions are a bad thing. I think in this case they are a good thing, but there always is a possibility to exempt certain practices from sanctions. For example, reporting of vulnerabilities could be one of these areas where you do not want to have sanctions to have a large impact, because you want perhaps to at least keep to a certain degree this transnational community of security researchers together. And if this is an issue if this is an important issue, it's also something that could be negotiated, or could be that certain countries could talk about how to harmonize these kind of issues and how to prevent certain fragmentation going on.
So for my last question, I want to shift track a little bit and talk about the role and nature of academia in this challenge. Um, in my purely anecdotal experience, we've seen a trend that academic research has, at least to some degree, shifted from being purely for the driven by curiosity and for its own sake, to being a bit more commercially driven and oriented. What with funding cuts to academia, there's more interest in graduating quickly by students. It's more commercially driven. It's more career driven. First of all, is this correct, or am I just seeing things? And second of all, if it is correct, do you feel that there is a danger to the continued availability of these kinds of researches and vulnerability findings driven by, I'm going to say, curious students, professors, and academic researchers at universities whose ultimate goal it is to find new things?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. It's also a difficult question, but yeah, of course, this is at the risk of oversimplifying. So you mean like before you had the sort of ivory tower, and now you have people thinking from the very start of their research project about the
what are the real world applications? The ivory tower,
yeah,
really good way of looking at it. Yeah, thank you.
But I think in a sense that, of course, it very much depends on the discipline, the academic discipline and the field of study, I would say. I mean, there have been fields of study that have always been a very close connection to like an application, right? So engineering studies, for example. Then I have other fields of study like cultural studies, language studies, that have a longer way, at least, to travel from like the research to any sort of application. But I think, yes, there might be a general trend to, or a more critical attitude, perhaps also from the funders and from society as a whole to academia, in a sense that, well, you have to sort of plausibilize your positive impact on society. And well, I think it's, I think it's true. So this would be my first answer. But still, there's a lot of variation going on, I think. We have, like in the German case, in our case, it's different. When you work at universities, it's different than when you work at independent research institutes, as, for example, IFSH. IFSH always wanted to have this sort of impact. So me and my colleagues, we give policy advice. So a lot of, or this is a huge part of our mission to give policy advice, and something that we also want to do. So this is nothing that we perceive as a distraction, so to speak, from our research, but something that we think is part of our job very much. But this might be different in other university cultures. So it very much depends on the institution. So now the question, is it good or bad? I think both to certain degrees. Of course, if you would be forced to only do research that is, for example, that can be transferred into commercial products, that would be bad, because then academia itself would fall into this trap of market failure, like many commercial areas. And I think publicly funded research in many cases is a way to address market failures. So you produce knowledge where nobody else, who is just driven by monetary incentives, would produce this kind of knowledge. So we shouldn't force academics to always look into ways to commercialize. On the other hand, I think the other extreme would also be not beneficial. I think so. When you look at the way academic careers are built, then and then in the past, or at least in Germany, you see that peer-reviewed journal articles are everything. Teaching is rated much or honored much less, which is a bad thing, I think, because I think teaching is very important. And then there is something like social impact. And I think other countries like the Netherlands, for example, they took greater efforts into also measuring and honoring public outreach activities, for example. So I think this is a good thing to also communicate to researchers. Well, we do not force you to do this, but if you do this, if you talk at like a debating club in a cafe in your city or something, or if you talk to journalists, or if you publish an article in a newspaper, we also think this is important work, and we accept this, and we also give you certain benefits for this. I think this is a healthy and a necessary even development to think of academic research in a broader way. So it's not just publishing in scientific papers. It's also teaching. It's also public outreach. And then finally coming to vulnerability research, I think this is a very special case. So it would be hard to overgeneralize. I think this is very special case because here, in this case, knowledge can be weaponized so quickly as maybe in no other field of study. And this makes it all the more important to keep and assure a certain degree of independence of this research. So this is why we talked about these monopolization efforts, so state monopolizations efforts before. I think this is something that should be avoided as much as possible, because let's face it, I mean, many cybersecurity researchers, or in most cases, or in many cases at least, they are intrinsically motivated. There are many ethical hackers out there. We should preserve this kind of value system also, and it would be a bad thing if somebody would force these researchers to be included in a process that always channels their knowledge to state entities, or that also it would be bad to completely commercialize this whole area. I think this is in a paper that we published, we sort of identified different models or ideal cases of regulations in this area. And we ended up by saying that, well, the state monopolization model should not be the only one, and it's problematic in itself, but also the model that only trusts the market and does not regulate anything, not even the protection of cybersecurity researchers, would also be wrong, because there are many areas where we need some sort of public funding, for example, in the open source software ecology, because otherwise we have market failures. So we ended up, maybe unsurprisingly, by sort of advertising this middle ground model.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned open source, because, I mean, back in the Middle Ages when I was at university, you know, a lot of the hacking, quote unquote, whether it's software development, whether it's you know, trying the door handles, was done for fun and reputation rather than publication. And I mean, one of the criticisms levied at a lot of bug bounty platforms these days is that they purely commercialize this kind of research. And I realize that the classic university student just trying things out and saying, hey, look, I found a big vulnerability, here it is, bears its own dangers. But it's a really interesting point, these tensions between, you know, state monopolization, over commercialization, and freedom to engage in academic curiosity, which, even though it's not commercially driven, you know, benefits everybody because it generates more research.
I think there are, but this is not my field of study, but I think there are interesting psychological studies out there that would perhaps show you that if you give monetary rewards for certain practices, it could also have a negative impact in cases of those people which are intrinsically motivated. So there are lessons to apply from psychology here. As you mentioned, the criticism of bug bounty platforms, I think overall, of course, bug bounty platforms is a great idea, and the overall impact is positive. But there's also criticism that some companies might use this sort of tailor-made bug bounties. So the bug bounty platform offers them sort of their own platform, their own bug bounty, which is then tailor-made, so the rules that apply are basically decided by the company. And there is criticism that this sometimes is used as a cheap way instead of setting up a proper vulnerability disclosure policy, because it's way cheaper, or at least it doesn't require as much effort, because setting up a proper vulnerability disclosure policy, then you need to involve a lot more people in your organization, and you have to think about a lot more issues. So this is also criticism. So it's basically a counterfactual argument, right? So it's hard to prove, but there are certainly things going on in this whole commercialization development which are not always beneficial.
So which leads me, I think, to the final question, promise. And this goes squarely back into your territory. Do you think some kind of public support for bug bounties would be a way to ensure more stability and more dependability?
Yeah, I mean, as I've said before, I think there are cases of market failure, and so especially when we talk about open source software, and like, for example, the European Union did this before with the FOSSA program. So this is, of course, only a limited amount of public money that went into these projects, but they set up more than 10 bug bounty programs that were dedicated to this area. But then, of course, there's also companies like Google that also invest in open source software bug bounties. So there are both public and private actors that acknowledge that there is a problem that cannot be solved just by commercial mechanisms, so to speak. And I would maybe also go one step further by saying that once you invest public money, you have also more leverage, perhaps, in terms of the rules that apply, in terms of the payments and all of that. And this could also have a beneficial impact. So you could prevent the kind of thing that I mentioned before, that somebody is, let's say, softening the rules, not applying to ISO standards, for example, and seeing bug bounty as a cheap way out of all this responsibility to support responsible disclosure. So it would be beneficial both in terms of addressing market failures, but also in terms of standard setting or the strengthening of already existing standards that might be weakened by other actors.
Okay, that's good. That's a good answer. That's interesting. I want to wrap up, being respectful of your time, and ask you if you have any closing points that you'd like to make, any arguments, any calls to action, any observations. It's a good chance for you to bring out, any research that you're engaged in that you want to call attention to.
Yeah, perhaps one general point would be that we talked a lot about the role of governments. I think it's important to keep in mind that we should focus both on things that governments should do or should improve. So we talked about the legal environment and the need to harmonize and improve the protection of security researchers. And we talked about international coordination. But it's also important to look at things that governments should avoid, or to look at limits to governmental actions. And so I think we have to look at both sides. And you started by describing, of course, the vulnerabilities that exist and the exploitation and the social harm. And this is all true, of course. But it could also lead to the impression that there's nothing worth preserving, or that the situation that we now have is so bad that we could do all kinds of things, and that would be beneficial because we cannot make it worse. And I think we can make it worse. For example, by making it more difficult for cybersecurity researchers to collaborate on a transnational level. So we talk about the unintended side effects of sanctions, for example, as I've said, or we talk about phenomena like weaponizing bug bounties. We've seen this in the context of the Russian war in Ukraine, where people came up with the idea of setting up bug bounties to pay researchers if they found vulnerabilities, like, for example, in Russian critical infrastructures, which I think is a bad thing. So there is a transnational community that is very much worth to be preserved and also to be protected in many ways from the impact of state actions. So we also need to talk about limits to state actions, not just about more state actions or more public spending.
I think that's a great closing point. I think it's a good theme for this conversation as well. Is the role of sorry if there's a bit of construction noise out here. There's a role of the government and how that can be controlled and how we can ensure oversight and limit it to what is really necessary and beneficial to everybody. So I think with that, I want to wrap up. Mischa, thank you very, very much for joining today. Thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation.
I love the fact that we finally get a more politically and geopolitically involved and informed perspective on a topic that from our side of things has primarily been treated from the commercial side. I would love to learn more about your work on this. I will link to your institute, and if you have any papers that you'd like to share, I'll gladly put those in the video or podcast description. With that, I want to thank you again for joining us. Thank everybody who is watching or listening. Please don't forget, like, subscribe, and share as usual. Visit us at gfcrc.org, the Good Faith Cybersecurity Researchers Coalition, as well as the Cybersecurity Advisors Network, cybersecurityadvisors.network. And thanks again, and hope to hear from you soon. Stay safe and have a good one.
Thank you again, and goodbye.